So the Trump transition team is apparently compiling a list of current and former U.S. officers in the military for possible court-martial. Now, I don't know where this list is or who put the list together or where the names came from or who decided was going to be on that list. And I don't know where that list is. I'm sure that there's somebody inside of Trump's transition team or President-elect Trump's transition team that knows who they are. And I've heard of people submitting names to them for review, potentially to look into what their actions were over the past 4 years and during the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is one of the things that they're really focused on is any officer that was involved in the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. They want to do like an independent review on those individuals and see how they impacted the withdrawal and like if their decision making had any impacts on it that were a negative in manner. Now, apparently these officials working in the transition team are creating a commission to investigate the 2021 with Afghanistan withdrawal specifically. And they're going to be gathering all kinds of information like who is directly involved in this decision making for the military, how it was executed and like how it was actually carried out, whether or not these military leaders should be eligible for possible courts-martial charges, even up to as serious as the charge of treason, apparently, allegedly. Now, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats, a guy by the name of Matt Flynn, apparently has been helping spearhead the effort, though his lawyer or his attorney publicly stated that he has absolutely nothing to do with the transition team and is not going to be involved in reviewing any type of military justice matters. Now, President-elect Donald Trump has been very hard on the withdrawal from Afghanistan, saying things like, quote, "It was the most embarrassing day in the history of our country," end quote. He also said that, quote, "It was a humiliation," end quote, and other various things in very harsh judgment of the situation. I know he's made a lot of promises to some of his constituents saying that he was going to investigate this further, especially as a result of the fact that there were 13 service members that lost their lives during the evacuation. So I would imagine that this is something that's, higher on his priority list as far as the military is concerned. I know he's got a significant relationship with a lot of the Gold Star families. He's been very supportive of them from what I've been told. Though I would say, as far as like justifying treason charges, that's a tough one. That's going to be a tough one to prove in court. So we'll see how far that goes. But apparently the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction blamed both the current president and the former president's administrations for the results of the U.S. evacuation in 2021. So now President-elect Donald Trump first reached an agreement with the Taliban in 2020 to withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan, which was at the time roughly 13,000 people. And they were also planning on releasing 5,000 Taliban prisoners at the time as well. Now, I know there's a lot of discussion as to whether or not they should have executed the withdrawal from Bagram Air Base instead of from Kabul. And I know that the majority of military leaders that I know personally said that it would have been a much more effective way to do it because it was a much more defensible position. It would have been much more orderly rather than the kind of situation you saw at Hamid Karzai, just because there would have been more security measures in place to prevent certain things from happening. A lot of this is still speculation because there's no way to go back in time and see which way worked better because you can't go back and try one way over the other. I also know that the current person who President-elect Donald Trump has or is talking about appointing to become Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, has been openly criticizing the withdrawal of Afghanistan, saying, quote, "The U.S. lost the war and wasted billions of dollars," end quote. Pete Hegseth also called the withdrawal a, quote, "humiliating retreat," end quote. Pete Hegseth also said that leaders at the Pentagon were not held accountable for the deadly attack at Abbey Gate, which resulted in the deaths of 13 U.S. service members and around 170 Afghan civilians. Pete also went on to say that they were not held accountable for subsequent U.S. airstrikes in Kabul that officials thought would kill the Islamic State group leader behind this attack, but instead killed 10 innocent Afghans, including 7 children. So Pete Hegseth has been pretty critical of how the evacuation was carried out as well. He also said, quote, "These generals lied, they mismanaged, they violated their oath, they failed, they disgraced our troops and our nation, they got people killed unnecessarily," end quote, he wrote. He also went on to say, quote, "And to this moment, they keep their jobs. Worse, they continue to actively erode our military and its values by capitulating to civilians with radical agendas. They are an embarrassment with stars on their shoulders," end quote. So, like I said, Pete Hegseth has been openly, he's a former National Guardsman, so he served in Afghanistan. I believe he did 2 tours, and he's been pretty critical of how this evacuation was carried out. I know that a lot of folks have in the community in general, but here's the interesting thing. So the transition team, Trump's transition team, is looking at the possibility of recalling several commanders to active duty so that they could then charge them in a court-martial. Some of these folks retired or they got out of the military, and you can't charge them if they're a civilian, but they're looking into trying to possibly bring them back to active duty so that they could then charge them with charges and court-martial them. Now, it's speculation as to whether or not this is actually going to be like pursued like 100%. And it's also speculation to say that they're going to charge these officers or any of the officers or any people involved with treason charges, because you have to be able to prove a significant amount of things in order to prove that somebody should be charged with treason. Now, Article 3, Section 3, Clause 1 of the Treason Clause in the Manual of Courts Martial, it says that treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. That's going to be very difficult to prove, right? You know, without a whole lot of people coming forward. Not saying it's impossible, but it would be a tough one to get worked out. Now, that when it comes to levying war, it says early judicial interpretation of the meaning of treason in terms of levying war was conditioned by the partisan struggles of the early 19th century, which involved the treason trials of Aaron Burr and his associates. Now, 2 of Burr's Confederates, Chief Justice Marshall, speaking for himself, and 3 other justices confined the meaning of levying war to the actual waging of war. And then, quote, "However flagitious may be the crime of conspiring to subvert by force the government of our country, such conspiracy is not treason. To conspire to levy war and actually to levy war are distinct offenses. The first must be brought into open action by the assemblage of men for a purpose treasonable in itself, or the fact of levying war cannot be or cannot have been committed. So far, this principle has been carried out that it has been determined that the actual enlistment of men to serve against the government does not amount to levying war." The next thing he said was, quote, "On the contrary, if war be actually levied, that is, if a body of men be actually assembled for the purpose of effecting a force, a treasonable purpose, all those who perform any part, however minute or however remote from the scene of action, and who are actually leagued in the general conspiracy are to be considered as traitors. But there must be an actual assembling of men for the treasonable purpose to constitute a levying of war." So, again, it's going to be super tough to prove that any of that, because obviously nobody levied war against the United States. Nobody assembled men or assembled soldiers in order to commit or levy war on the United States from in the United States. So that would be a really tough thing to prove. I think more than likely they'll probably go after other types of charges outside of treason, just because it'll be easier for them to result in the conviction than trying to pursue treason. Now, your guess is as good as mine as to whether or not this is actually going to take place, or if this is just hearsay and people are just talking about it and they're considering it. I do know that they have some strong, sweeping plans that they want to, conduct, especially in regards to the Pentagon. And I'm sure that the offices in the Pentagon are scrambling to try to figure out what they're going to do in preparation for this transition, because it's going to be very different than the previous administration. And anytime an administration changes with another administration, especially when it's from an opposing party or a party with different views than the previous one, there's an adjustment period. And, this would be the first time, if Pete Hegseth gets confirmed, this will be the first time that a Secretary of Defense is confirmed to the seat who is not like been a previous general or heavily involved in the defense industry for an extensive period of time. So it'll also be very different in that sense. Plus, he's much younger than most of the average secretaries of defense have been in the past. Whether or not this is actually going to go through and take place, your guess is as good as mine. But I have heard from a lot of folks in the military that there have been, lists of names that are getting submitted to them for whatever purpose, whether they're going to investigate them or they're going to determine whether or not they need to be moved around. Your guess is as good as mine, but it's definitely going to be an interesting year.